Hello, friends, and welcome back to Artist Questions. This is the mostly weekly live stream where we look at some of the biggest questions facing contemporary artists today. My name is Dan Curtis. I am an artist, an arts educator, and a writer from London, and I'm also head of education at Exchange Art, who make all this possible. So thank you again to the amazing Exchange Art. This is the first in a mini series of 3 episodes. Could be more, but I'm going to start with 3. I mean, we could talk about this concept for the whole rest of our lives in many ways. But it's the first in a series around imposter syndrome. And we're going to break that down a little bit in a second. And each week we're going to look at a kind of different aspect of what imposter syndrome is, how it manifests in artists, and why it's so important for us to break through it as artists and how we can begin to do so. So I want to begin this episode, which I'm titling When Do I Become a Real Artist? By looking first at the idea of imposter syndrome itself, that feeling that I'm not a real artist, asking when will I get there, and what imposter syndrome is and where the idea comes from. So, imposter syndrome, the phrase was coined in the 1970s by two scientists doing an amazing study, Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Imes, to describe high achieving women who felt like frauds despite their levels of success and their evidence of their success. It's an absolutely fascinating study, and it's what brought the term imposter syndrome into the public eye. We're going to talk more about that study towards the end. But for now, just know that that's the kind of context we're coming from. And there's a nice definition of I guess, more modern definition of imposter syndrome in a paper by Deanna L. Walker and Donald Cyklowski. And they talk about imposter syndrome like this. They say it's the subjective experience of perceived self-doubt in one's abilities and one's accomplishments. That's the first half, compared with others, despite evidence to suggest the contrary. So it's important to see these two parts when we come to imposter syndrome, because I think there's some ways that people talk about imposter syndrome, which come to in a second, which I think are unhelpful. But in this stake, we're looking at it in terms of these studies, which is perceived self-doubt in one's abilities and accomplishments, which is like the visceral feeling we can get. But it's particularly when compared with others. And that's really important to understand. For us as artists, imposter syndrome really comes in the compare and despair and the looking at other artists and feeling like they are real artists. They're the ones that are ahead doing it properly. Whereas I'm just here kind of mucking around and what I'm doing is not really valuable and doesn't really make sense. Or, you're always waiting to, when is it that I will catch up to being an artist? When is it that I will become truly that and feel that way and understand that and think, yes, I have succeeded. I am there. And then the other part of it then is this comparison with others. And then the other part is despite evidence to suggest the contrary. Imposter syndrome is this strange thing where it doesn't matter how much success we have, seemingly in our life, or the things that we've achieved, the things we put over the line, or just the basic act of showing up and making our art, which is the greatest form of success as an artist. It doesn't matter about any of those. Imposter syndrome still drills in this idea of perceived self-doubt in one's abilities, even if you are, quote unquote, a successful artist. So it's a really interesting thing to be aware of. It's this essentially, it's the cycle of compare and despair again. Let's also look at what it isn't, and I just want to expand on this a little bit. I saw the other day this clip on YouTube. I think it was a YouTube story from a kind of one of those sort of bro hustle, lone wolf, alpha male podcast guys, and he was saying imposter syndrome is a good thing because if you haven't earned the right to be at the table or in the room, then you shouldn't be there. And it gives you the motivation to work harder so that you can kind of get a seat at the table. So I hope you can see already the issue with that in regards to the definition of imposter syndrome that Walker gave, is that this kind of bro podcaster guy was saying that, yeah, if you haven't earned the right to be there, then you shouldn't be there. So he's saying imposter syndrome is like when you don't have enough skills or ability or a track record and you're just sort of pretending to be there. Yeah. Which is funnily how a lot of us feel in the imposter syndrome situation. We feel like we don't have the skills, the ability, or the track record. But actually, imposter syndrome is the opposite. It is actually having the skills, the ability, the track record, and the fact that you're showing up, no matter how small that is, and still feeling like you haven't, still feeling like you haven't got the right to be sitting at this table. Do you see the difference there? It's not like he's sort of saying that imposter syndrome is kind of simply you just haven't learned enough yet. You haven't worked your way to that part of the job, which is a complete misunderstanding. And that's just not being, at that level yet. And that's totally fine as well. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about already being at a acceptable level and already being successful and already being good enough, which you are as an artist if you are simply making, but feeling like you're not, and that you're not supposed to be here, and that you're not real. So that's a really important distinction. Let's have a couple of look at a couple of reasons why then as an artist you might feel this sense of imposter syndrome when you feel like you are not a real artist, that you're just sort of faking your way through it, and that everyone else knows what they're doing. So I'm going to start by reading a quote from the book Art and Fear. I'll just bring it up here, which is a book by David Bales and Ted Orland. It's a book that we have discussed a lot on this channel already. And this is a really helpful part in a chapter called Fears About Yourself. And it's kind of talking about these concepts around imposter syndrome without naming it as such. And it's in a section called Pretending, this sort of sense of pretense of acting. And they say this, that the fear that you're only pretending to do art is the readily predictable consequence of doubting your own artistic credentials. After all, you know much better than anyone else the accidental nature of much that appears in your art, not to mention all those elements that originated with others. And from there, it's only a short hop to feeling like you're just going through the motions of being an artist. It's easy to imagine that real artists know what they're doing and that they, unlike you, are entitled to feel good about themselves and their art. Fear that you are not a real artist causes you to then undervalue your own work. Okay, so let's look at that first section before we come to the second section. This is really important, this idea that real artists are entitled to feel good about themselves and their work. I think so many of us can relate to that feeling that I can't celebrate myself because I'm not real. I'm not, far enough along the journey. And those people out there who are doing it properly are allowed to do that. and they can celebrate themselves. And when we do that, as they say, there is this sense of continuing undervalue of our work and believing that what we do doesn't have enough meaning, or what we do is not important in this world. And that grows into a much bigger issue around the idea of shame and guilt, which we'll come to in a minute. The next section, which is interesting, says this: before chucking it all in for the J job, however, consider the dynamics at work here. Both making art and viewing art require an ongoing investment of energy. In moments of weakness, the myth of the extraordinary provides the excuse for an artist to quit trying to make art. I'm just going to read that last line again. In moments of weakness, the myth of the extraordinary provides the excuse for an artist to quit trying to make art. So you see what Bales and Norland are saying here. They're saying that to be in this place of imposter syndrome, we have to believe in a myth. And that myth is that other artists are extraordinary, or that I must become extraordinary before I become real. And because I am not so, then my work is undervalued. And actually, the whole story, which is not true, becomes a very easy way for artists to then give up. Yeah. Or feel like they have a reason to give up, or a reason to forget all that they're doing. And friends, I'm not saying this because, oh yeah, I've moved past that. I'm into the extraordinary, or I know how I feel about my work. I feel this every day. That what's the point of what I'm doing? And I get stuck in all these cycles of compare and despair, and thinking that other artists have got it all together, etc., etc. And as we've said a lot of time on this channel, there are so many systemic issues, barriers to do with finance and nepotism and race and gender, that do make it really difficult to make steps in some of the areas you might want to make steps in. But that doesn't mean that you are any less valuable in yourself, or that your work is any less valuable. Yes, it should be easier to be an artist. Sometimes it is so difficult. But however, while things are slowly changing and getting better, the most important thing for you is to be showing up and making your work. That makes you that extraordinary person. Okay. And even if you're not showing up, even if you're taking a break from your work, or you're still working towards getting to the studio, then you don't need to devalue yourself either. You're not any less real because you aren't showing at this place, or aren't selling this work, or something like that. Because that realism myth and that extraordinary myth becomes an excuse for you to be able to give up. And I don't mean excuses in like the Bro podcast way of you just making excuses if you need to work harder. I mean an excuse for your already tired emotions to grip onto another idea. Yeah. Okay, so then battling that myth of the extraordinary, another reason why we might feel stuck in imposter syndrome as artists is thinking that without the approval of these extraordinary people or the audience, that we are somehow not real again, that we are falling behind. And this is from a section of end of the section called Fears About Others. The lesson here is simply that courting approval, even that of peers, puts a dangerous amount of power in the hands of the audience. Worse yet, the audience is seldom in a position to grant or withhold approval on the one issue that really counts, which is whether or not you're making progress in your work. The audience is in a good position to comment on how they're moved or challenged or entertained by your work, but have little knowledge or interest in your process. Audience comes later. The only pure communication is between you and your work. Like I said, the ultimate success, the ultimate drive, the show that you are a real artist is that you are doing your best to show up and ideate and make and commune with your materials. If you are communing with your materials, if you are working towards trying to create things in whatever way that means, then you are already an extraordinary and successful artist. because again, the lesson here is the audience is not in a position to grant approval on that. Yes, they can tell you what they feel about the work, but they can't tell you that yes, your process is enough or something like that. They don't know about this. And part of the issue is that a lot of that feels quite lonely. And we're going to tackle this a bit more in the sort of what we can do about imposter syndrome section in a moment. But there's that feeling of isolation, which the mixture of that these people are extraordinary and I'm not, and I need audience approval, but they can't give it to me. That puts us in such a place of sadness and fear and isolation. We'll come back to this section in a minute. Another reason why you might be stuck in imposter syndrome is because for artists, as an artist specifically, is because for artists, we don't have that clear career ladder to climb. There aren't those markers of success like a promotion or a pay rise or traditional kind of capitalist markers of you have made it, you have become real, you are now this. Yes, we can study and get qualifications, but what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean we qualify to do certain things or things will immediately happen. When one qualifies to become a doctor or a nurse, that means they are allowed access to this area. For artists, it isn't the same. We don't get that same sense of leveling up or a career ladder and progression to follow. But as I said in the artist toolkit course, which you can watch on the YouTube channel, Healthy Artist YouTube channel, there was a section on that and going a little bit deeper into this, but also saying that is a really positive thing as well, because it means that although those are struggles, it also means that you are in control of the things that you do and in the career that you have and in the ways that you work, which is wonderful. Next, another reason, and I think this is really important and something I want to spend a little bit of time on here in today's stream, is that you might feel imposter syndrome has gone beyond the feeling of, oh, my work isn't good enough or my art isn't good enough. And you feel that your whole calling as an artist, as a person, as a human, your meaning and what you're doing in this world is being called into question. There's sort of a spiritual crisis, a moral crisis occurring for you. And it's really important to understand something, which is the difference between guilt and shame. The shame researcher Brené Brown talks about it and puts it in a really simple way that guilt is the feeling of I've done something bad. I haven't lived up to this expectation. I haven't done the things I wanted to do. I've made a mistake. So I've done something bad. Whereas shame says, I am bad. I am bad. I am not enough. It's not about an action that you've taken. It becomes more about a whole idea of your personhood. And shame then around imposter syndrome, you can see how that feeds in. Imposter syndrome starts with that sort of compare and despair. I shouldn't be here. I'm not allowed here. There's barriers to my access. And that's proving that I'm not good enough or my work's not good enough and that I'm never going to get there. And then that turns into I am a failure within myself, and it starts to feel deeper. And I think also connected with that is the way capitalism then operates within that and our kind of modern grind culture and how that seeps into art spaces and the art world as well. The writer and video essayist Frankie McNamara, who does the series Meditations for the Anxious Mind, if you've not seen that, highly recommend going on YouTube. It's amazing writing, extremely biting, but also very funny. And he stands next to people in the street and recites these incredible thoughts and monologues around different areas. And his most recent one is called Hustle Culture is the New Heroin. a case study on the neoliberal self. And I mean heroin there is in the drug, a case study on the neoliberal self. And it's really about the idea of how capitalism manifests in people, particularly young entrepreneurs these days. And I can really see this in the arts as well. And he's talking about the sort of Protestant work ethic, the idea that hard work is the most important thing. And but now that many of us, don't believe in sort of like, working for God or for a higher power of any kind of deliberate nature, that our meaning, is shifted somewhat. And he says this line inside the talk: when faith gets replaced with self belief, a lack of ambition is a case of morality. I'll just say that again. When faith gets replaced with self belief, a lack of ambition is a case of morality. So you've got two parts there: faith getting replaced with self-belief. So the idea of like believing that our work is taking us to a sort of higher source, a higher sense of meaning and purpose in life, has been replaced with the idea of believing in oneself, and that you are the one that shapes and creates your destiny, and you just got to grind and hustle and work harder. Again, it completely ignores the systems around us, any systemic issues. It puts it all back onto you. And then because it does that, in an almost spiritual fashion, a lack of ambition, then, if you feel like you don't know what you're doing, or like you don't want to strive for this crazy hustle culture and bring your art into that, becomes a case of morality. It can seem as if, because what's been replaced from sort of a faith stance is this idea of self-belief. Therefore, if you haven't got enough ambition in yourself, then, well, you've got a moral issue. And I think that is something quite probing around the feeling of imposter syndrome as an artist, where so much of the artist experience now is not necessarily about making work and communing with materials in the studio, but is so much about presenting oneself on social media, online, at private views, etc., etc. And when you feel like you're not doing enough and everyone else is real, then it feels like a moral issue, a steep spiritual issue for you, that you are somehow the problem. Yeah. Then we've got to come back to capitalism again. And it's also really important to note here that, again, this brings us back into a state of isolation, just like we were saying about this fear of the extraordinary artist, this fear of the audience not giving us the approval we want, the shame that surrounds that, and then this case of morality in our ambitions, all serves to isolate us. And that feeds perfectly into capitalism's narrative, because capitalism, especially in this late stage neoliberal form, like Frankie McNamara was talking about, really thrives when people are fragmented or individualized, siloed, isolated. And this is not just a side effect of capitalism, or, we're doing it wrong or something. It is the point of it. Yeah, because it needs people to compete with one another rather than cooperate. So instead, the system that encourages us to see one another as kind of rivals, or sort of, war for kind of scarcity of, attention or fame or money, etc., or a scarcity of morality in terms of kind of, there's not enough left for me to build my identity until I find something original and real or something like that, becomes itself the main problem, rather than seeing any sort of system, or seeing imposter syndrome, this kind of fake sense that you're not good enough, as the issue. You just see yourself as the issue always. And capitalism just loves reinforcing that, because it's so helpful for capitalism's growth. So as artists, then, as a way of rounding up for this final section, the question is, how do then we reframe this idea? Well, on the false solution side, we could just go back to the hustle culture thing, or the bro podcast vibe, or anything like that, and just say the solution then is just to work harder and get better. But of course, that then for artists maps onto a constant need for the validation that we are doing such things. And we need loads of exhibitions, sales, likes, virality, representation. But the problem is, none of those, again, prove that you belong or prove that you are real. It just moves the goalpost forward to the next thing and the next thing. Because creative work is itself ambiguous. Just turn myself up here a bit so you can see me. Creative work is ambiguous without these clear metrics, like we were saying earlier. Then the ambiguity space and the not getting the external validation, or maybe even when things just aren't really working in the studio at the moment and we're not seeing that kind of the things we've been trying haven't been like pulling off. We've been experimenting, but it's not really working. It just becomes this breeding ground for doubt. And that's when the imposter syndrome comes in. Oh, if you were a real artist, you wouldn't be having these kind of issues. Yeah. Which we know is just nonsense. So that's the not working harder or doing things more or having more success in terms of this external validation and waiting for the art world to hand you your validation. This is not going to be the solution to imposter syndrome. So what can be a solution then? Well, we'll talk a little bit about it now, but that's what we're going to focus on over the next few weeks as well. But one thing I want to say, and it's coming back to the start here, the 1978 paper, by Clance and Imes, the two scientists that came up with the term imposter syndrome. What makes the study so fascinating is that not only did these two women analyze other amazing women in their successful sector, but they also did group kind of therapy work to see what was the thing that would alleviate these feelings of imposter syndrome. And above all, it was community and it was connection with others. The complete opposite of everything that imposter syndrome gets us to come to as artists, as like isolated, siloed, capitalist serving solopreneurs. It comes back to community. So let me read a little bit about from the paper. It's just sort of like an overview of some of the paper about where what they did. So they proposed a therapeutic approach that they used for the participants with this imposter phenomenon. The technique included a group setting where people meet others who also are living with this experience. The researchers explained that the group meetings made a significant impact on their participants, and they proposed that this impact was a result of the realization that they were not the only ones who experienced these feelings. It's like it seems so simple, doesn't it? But it's like we're so in our own heads when it comes to imposter syndrome. It's all about isolating us. And here we go. I'm saying I don't feel like I fit in this art world. I feel like I'm going nowhere. I feel like my work's feeling shit. And someone else going, me too, pal. It's just the start of the reconnection and pulling yourself out of your own head and out of the cycle of negativity and self-doubt. It carries on. They proposed that this impact was a result of the realization that they were not the only ones who experienced these feelings. The participants were required to complete various homework tasks and assignments, as well as doing things like trying to recall all the people that they had really believed that they had fooled or tricked in the past into being this imposter. And then they would have to recall later why they received positive feedback in their life, and what about then that positive feedback made them perceive it in a negative light, or what about them made them perceive it in a negative light. And I think that's really interesting. You've got to ask yourself, when it comes to imposter syndrome, what is the narrative that I'm telling myself here? Is it the myth narrative, like we were saying earlier? What have I got to believe? What about it is making this negative, me seeing myself in negative light? Is it something larger? Is it upbringing? Is it my barriers into the art world because of who I am? Is it something like a mental health issue? Is it neurodiversity? All these things are really important to start to try and get to the root of. And the researchers then concluded that simply extracting the self-doubt before the event occurs helps eliminate feelings of imposterism. And it was recommended that people struggling with this experience seek support from friends and family. And that's it. You're embedding yourself in community. And so for me, what I want to kind of leave you with is the idea again that often with these things, the symptom, the imposter syndrome, is kind of like the evidence of the deeper root problem. Yeah, like the symptom is the leaf on the tree, but it's not the final thing. It's just the leaf is just the product of the roots. Yeah. So what is the root of the issue? What is the story that you are telling yourself as an artist that's making you feel or think, yes, I am an imposter, I don't deserve to be here? Is it going back to, I am not a real artist? Is it the myth of the extraordinary and everything like that? Is it the idea that you are morally failing because you're stuck in that neoliberal capitalist mindset? Where is the root of your imposter syndrome? That's what I kind of want to leave you with this week. We've got to remember, just as a closing little message, that there is no real artist. There is no threshold that one can cross and then become an artist. We know it from the fact that people who we might consider as famous or, influential or iconic in some way talk about feeling like they've not done enough, etc., etc. It shows that even the high levels of fame and what seems to be external validation does nothing really in the end to relieve imposter syndrome. What does relieve imposter syndrome is beginning to discuss it, understand the root of it, and talk about it in community. Final little quote from Art and Fear to finish. For artists, survival means finding an environment where their art is valued and art making is encouraged. In a supportive environment, one finds, more often than not, within the artistic community itself, approval and acceptance often become linked, even indistinguishable. Okay, friends, thank you for joining me today. It's been an absolute joy to have you here. This is part one of a 3-part series of Smashing Imposter Syndrome. Today was when do we become a real artist? And I hope that this beginning conversation has helped to unpack some of that. Really enjoyed being with you today. As always, you can reach out to me on X or on Instagram. And if you want to listen to more stuff like this, please go back and watch other videos on the Healthy Artist YouTube channel. Or you can listen to the Healthy Artist podcast with myself and Martha Lamont, which is a bi-weekly podcast where we interview other artists and each other all about things like this. We've also got a couple of big events coming up in the new year, and thinking about this whole thing of community and connecting with each other. We are going to be starting the Healthy Artist community, and we're going to have IRL events beginning in London in January, and then also online courses run by Martha in the new year. It's all on the healthyartist.com. Go and check it out and see what's going on. Subscribe to our newsletter and you'll be the first to know, as always, about everything going on. Thanks again, friends, and I hope to see you next week for part 2. Until then, have a lovely rest of the day and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.